Um, um, Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you so much for coming this afternoon. It's such a nice and intimate crowd that I almost wish it was back in the day where we could be in a room around a table and be sipping on coffee while we have really nice, engaging conversations. But here we are, thanks to COVID. And so, thank you for. I know at this time of the year, everyone is really, really tired of all of these Zoom meetings and Zoom presentations. And so, I just really want to thank you for making time to join this seminar. So, my presentation is titled. I'm making this big assumption that everyone who's come here has already read the very tiny bio that Qcobani sent out, and I'm wondering if I think everybody already knows, but my name is Ziyanda Majombozi, and I teach at the University of Pretoria. I teach anthropology there, and I recently completed my PhD at Wits in anthropology. And my presentation today is titled Decolonising the Tongue, thinking about motherhood, language, identity, and belonging. And I was thinking about this title after sending it to Qcobani and thinking about how it might actually be a little bit clickbaity. And I panicked a little bit because like, oh my goodness, especially with decolonizing being sort of like the buzzword at the moment. So of course one panics when people look a little bit interested in an academic conversation, because like it can be because they're interested in anthropology, but because they think something amazing about decolonizing is about to happen. So I thought maybe let me just clarify, just in case the topic is a clickbait, what it is that I will actually be doing and what it is that I won't be doing in the session. In this session, I won't be sort of like giving you guys sort of like a rundown or step-by-step list on how to decolonize your tongue. I also won't be giving advice on how to decolonize your tongue, but instead I'm going to be offering a presentation of some of the ways in which my participants in my research thought about language and how it connects to language, identity, and belonging, particularly during what I call the decolonial moment, which can sort of like, one could think about it in terms of at the onset of the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall protests around 2015 all up the way to 2018. So think about it like that. That's sort of like the moment that the context within which my research was set in. This presentation is part of a much bigger piece of work, which is my PhD. And what that work does is it focuses on a small sample of Black middle class mothers in Johannesburg, which is a really unique sample in South Africa, in South African anthropology specifically, in their middle classness, their employment, their access to private healthcare, and access to comfortable housing. And this matters in this research mainly because up until now in South African anthropology of motherhood and of Black families, there's a tendency to center stories of poverty and illness and disease. So this, in one part, this project was an attempt to move away from that kind of single story of what mothering looks like in Black household and what it looks like for Black women. By really starting to think about, well, if we could think, are there other ways of thinking about motherhood that have absolutely nothing to do with single mothers or HIV or poverty? And so then the bigger piece of this work explores mothering through political climate, increasing technology, relationships, race, class, religion, and of course, some of the medical experiences that do occur or that are associated with childbearing. And so there are mainly two contributions that I make in the research, which is really to start thinking about how do Black mothers engage with knowledge, where it comes from, who it comes from, and how do they learn to be mothers in the context of increasing technology. So that's the first part of what this work offers. And then the second part of it is the one that looks at political climate at the time of my research, where issues of race, decolonization, and Blackness were really sort of like were put in center stage due to the Roads Must Fall and calls for decolonization movements that were happening at the time. And so the issue of language, which is what I'm going to be discussing today, forms part of that sort of like key contribution that I make in the PhD. So let me get into it. I guess a good place to start then when looking at language and thinking about it in terms of belonging and identity as mentioned, a good place to start is to look at the ways in which language was talked about, but also the ways in which it was used in the homes of my interlocutors. So as I mentioned, this is a small sample of 7 Black women who are all middle class in Johannesburg, mainly in the north of Johannesburg. So these are women who are really, living relatively comfortable lives, I can say. And so it came up, language then came up quite a lot in the research. It's a conversation that I regularly had with the mothers in the study, and it formed a substantial amount of conversation between my husband and myself when I was pregnant. And one of my participants, Tanji, spoke often about how her husband insisted on speaking their neck to her tummy when she was still pregnant, to make sure that the child really gets to be exposed to Benak as soon as he felt it was possible. It featured a lot in my conversations with Z, which was my other participant, and she emphasized how she wanted to make sure that she teaches her daughter both English and isiZulu. And she was worried that being in an interracial marriage and living in a neighborhood where English was a dominant language, it would be a bit of a challenge to really make sure that her child is proficient in the language. And this is a concern that a lot of the mothers had because they were all living in the north of Johannesburg. So the schools that their children were likely going to go to were primarily using English as a medium of instruction. But nonetheless, they were committed to making sure that language, and particularly the mother tongue, features strongly in the lives of their children. For some, like Qambela, it was more important in terms of how they name their children and so forth. But mainly making sure that their children's identity comes up or is reflected in the language that they speak and also the language in which they have been named. But the stories that I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation really is Kwayata and Zizile. I think in the interest of time, I'll just draw from their stories to talk about language. And my main point, I guess, the takeaway that I want you to walk away with is the fact that in the context of, the calls of decolonization, language was one of the few practical ways mothers felt they could use to prepare their children for relationships now, but also for relationships in the future. And a lot of the mothers that were in my study had attended Model C schools, and they had university education, and so of course this was a concern for them, and they had their own sort of like insecurities about their Blackness and their ability or proficiency in their own mother tongues. So this is really something that they wanted to make sure that their children don't have to deal with. And so a lot of the times they grappled with the place of English in African languages and how they socialize their children. And thus, language became a really nice outward expression that, okay, I've sort of achieved instilling some kind of, Black pride in my child, and they know where they come from and they can speak their language. And so it was like, this is one of the few ways I can really be like, okay, I don't know how they're going to feel about themselves and their Blackness later on in life, and whether or not they'll be proud to be Black, but at least they'll speak an African language and they'll speak their mother tongue. And so, in a way, competency in an African language signaled sort of like a Blackness that was acknowledged and also celebrated. But the other thing the other way in which my participants thought about language, which I'm going to discuss here, is how competency in an African language was seen as access, right? It was seen as an ability to access intimate relationship with family, particularly family members that don't speak English, but also access to intimate relationship with other Africans in the diversity of Johannesburg, right? Because, if you want to really tug into the heartstrings and really get into relationship with someone, people really appreciate it when you speak their language. So they wanted their children to have access to these kinds of relationships. So that's sort of like the backdrop of what's happening in their minds. So of course, if there are these high expectations of what language is expected to do, or what you can achieve. I mean, imagine thinking or thinking of language as something that's accessing relationships and also a way to express pride and your Blackness and proudly Black in a context where decolonize proudly Black. It was a heightened racially context where race really mattered in ways that it had kind of, I mean, it had mattered before. This is South Africa, but in their life, it had started to become important now that they were mothers in ways that they hadn't thought of it before. So it was naturally a sense of loss then when the mothers, when their children couldn't speak an African language. And this loss was exacerbated by shaming of people who don't speak African languages. I mean, we've seen this, we saw this during the student protests as well, where it was like, well, what kind of, revolutionary can't speak even one single African language, or why are they only able to speak English in a twang? And so we've seen this shaming come up and up in multiple ways and in multiple platforms. I think in South Africa at the time, I think in 2018, it really became hot, a hot topic. The language issue became a hot one at the time when Umama Winnie-Zela Mandela had passed on, and at her memorial, her grandchildren as well as her great-grandchildren, they all spoke in English. And Unsiki Mazwai took to the Twitter streets to talk about how unacceptable it was, right? Saying things like it's not cute when a Black child only knows English. The Mandela great-grandchildren need to spend some time in the village. Speaking English to your children is a form of child abuse. You're alienating these children from their people. Stop it, right? And these kinds of tweets were trending. People on Twitter expressing their disappointment at the children of, such a renowned hero like Umama Winnie to be speaking English even after her dedicating her life, to fighting for Black people. Her own children feel that their own language is inferior. And people commented a lot, talking about how speaking English meant the loss of identity, especially if you speak it with a twang. And so following those tweets and sort of like that trend for that week, also on the radio, there was conversations once again asking whether or not it's wrong for one's children to only speak English. And these kind of questions, conversations just circulating. And I mentioned this example here, particularly to point us towards thinking about the shame that occurs when one's children don't speak an African language, and how, even though this was a really nice a context where we were celebrating Blackness, striving to celebrate African languages and all of these things, but unfortunately there were these undertones of shame and ridiculing of people who either have children who don't speak the language or who themselves don't speak the language. And these are the types of things that my participants were grappling with. They're sort of like in your face, they're on the radio when you're driving to work, they're on Twitter, and also you see just the mood of the country is changing, and you're feeling a little bit like, oh shucks, I need to do something here. So even though it was a useful conversation, there were many ways in which the debates and the language used in talking about these issues had it had some unintended consequences, and offered some really unfair value judgments that were harmful, but also it just didn't leave enough room to discuss the intricacies of home language acquisition and what exactly happens in people's homes and people's minds about language. And so in light of all of these conversations on popular media and in people's homes in Texas and everywhere, my participants naturally, when you're doing research, this became a hot topic that we discussed. And I remember quite in one conversation, so I'm in a room with the women that are doing the research, or that are my participants in the research. And she's visibly upset, and she's talking about how I don't know if you guys know Brown's market group on Facebook, and how someone in that group had written about how they get annoyed when couples are talking to their children in English, right? And she didn't respond to the person on Facebook because she didn't want to get dragged. But in this room that was kind of relatively a safe space, she was like, oh my gosh, I'm so frustrated. People can't go around judging because they don't know what's happening in people's homes. So she was particularly touched about this topic because her daughter spoke English. And this was mainly because she and her husband communicate in English because they can't speak each other's languages. And so it is something that was really close to her heart. And I mean, I'm just going to read an extract from one of our interviews. And she said, what a pain the language thing is. It is the worst thing because it's the one thing I knew I was going to struggle with. And it's happening exactly the way I thought it would. And it's just sad. I knew that because we speak English to each other, my husband speaks Lesotho and I speak isiZulu, we don't speak each other's languages. So how are the kids going to speak any other language? How are they not going to speak English? It's really sad. It's our reality though. I have to constantly forgive myself for it because I'm constantly bugging myself about it. And I'm just waiting for the time where someone else judges me. And I'm just like, pile it on. I'm the biggest judge of myself. It's already here. And then in this conversation, she moves on to reflect on her own childhood growing up in KZN and how she feels so sad that the language, the traditional ceremonies, the idioms, and all of the fun that she can have with language, she talked about how she's so stressed that her child won't be part of that. Her child won't have the kind of childhood that she had in terms of that sense of belonging to a particular culture and get to enjoy the richness of culture that can also be transmitted through language. But she's hopeful, and then moves on to talk about how she's going to teach her child both isiZulu and Sesotho, or well, her husband will teach the Sesotho part of it because of not wanting her to struggle with the judgments that come up when people disapprove of Black people who don't speak an African language. From Carter's words, it became clear that she had a sense of loss and a pain, and also just sort of like guilt about the fact that a child could not speak an African language. And I mean, she would be so defeated. I remember at times when I'd go visit her and she'd try and speak to her child in isiZulu and the child would respond in English. or just sort of like with a blank stare. She'd look at me and be like, ah, yeah, boy, this is what I'm talking about. This is my struggle with regards to language in this house. And initially, so she had, of course, thought about the fact that her child doesn't speak isiZulu or isiSotho, but she would usually sort of like dismiss it, that, but English is everywhere, at church, schools, at malls, everybody is speaking English. But at the time, with the recent calls for Black pride, Blackness, that is reflected in aesthetics, language, and more, the stakes were a little bit higher for her, and it just felt a little bit more urgent for her to do something about her daughter's language ability. The people on, on social media, but also people in her circles and the kind of gatherings that she went to, people spoke of a Blackness that is closely tied to an ability to speak an African language. And so it became more urgent for Twaita and for her daughter to learn to really speak isiZulu. And so what I argue here then is that the changing discourses around language, around Blackness, around what it means to be proud of your identity and where you come from, also, even though it was these big macro conversations happening in the country, they did shape the very intimate interactions that mothers and children had in their own homes. Mothers were starting to really reflect on their decisions to take their children to schools where English was the medium of instruction, finding ways to read and educate themselves about how to teach language in a bilingual home, things that they felt that they had not, they had thought about them, but not to an extent where they were worried about how it would really affect their children's sense of belonging in that way. And this kind of change in mind or urgency of this issue was kind of produced by the context at the time. So she then committed to sort of like really teach her daughter the language and tried to speak it to her as often as possible. This ethnographic snippet from Twaita's life, I think it allows us to see, for one, how language in homes can be seen, or how language continues to be really tied or connected to issues of belonging and identity, and at least an idea, I mean, as concerning as it can be and as shaming as it can be when not discussed with nuance, we can see how it's a significant part of how one identifies themselves. But I'm going to park that story and we're going to get back to it. I want to now move from Twaita's sort of like narrative around shame and loss and feeling left out of almost like the decolonial train and the blackness and the Black pride train through language, and move to another issue that I found really important in the research, and it was the idea of thinking about language as access to relationship. And I mean, growing up in South Africa, a lot of us already know some of the ways in which English and being able to speak English was seen as a great achievement, and how the need to speak English had a lot to do with how one is going to perform at school, university, but also in the job market. And also just sort of like, in a way, I mean, we've had a lot the ideas around how English will open doors for you. And this is in South Africa and in many places where English is kind of, or the colonial languages, as I say, has really important economic implications. And so, in a way, fluently speaking in English, even better if you speak in a particular accent, you're assumed to be educated, you're assumed to be well managed, you're assumed to have the right cultural capital or fit for the business. And so because of that, a lot of, parents had so much pride in their children who can speak English, and you'd hear them in the bus on their way to school speaking in English to their children, because it was just like, well, this child needs to, to speak English so that it can open doors for them. So in South Africa, language has always been, particularly English though, the English language has always been seen as access to economic opportunities, cultural capital, that is going to serve one well. But for my middle class Black women or Black mothers, I want to argue that for them, the ability to speak their mother tongue, their children's ability to speak mother tongue, was important for them to access family relationships. The parents in my study, I think, they were not in a place where, oh my gosh, my child is not going to get a job if they don't speak English. Because of their class status, some of the issues that our parents back in the day had to deal with, particularly with language, had shifted a little bit. And in some ways, the decolonial moment and the push for celebration of African languages and what that means for Blackness and identity and belonging, it legitimized a longing and a desire, I guess, for language that accesses relationships. And I think this was best illustrated by Zizile, one of my participants, and she talked about how she herself is not fluent in any African language and mainly speaks English. She grew up with her parents, mainly her dad specifically, speaking to her in English. And so now she has a child, and the sort of thing that had bothered her much before, but now that she had a child and could see sort of like the direction that the country was going, but also her relationship with people who speak Vernac, she became really concerned. And she says here that, and I'm going to read an excerpt from our interview again, and she says, it does concern me because I don't want it to impact Lizo. I would have loved for him to have a choice, but unfortunately, as his mother, I'm the biggest influencer. And if I don't speak fluent isiZulu, then chances of him speaking fluent isiZulu are not there. But I think he'll definitely understand the language because we are surrounded by the language. And then she speaks about how her husband speaks isiZulu and how her mom does speak isiZulu from time to time, even though the family mainly communicates in English. But the key thing here that she said that I found interesting was for him to communicate and have a good relationship with his grandparents, he needs to learn vernacular, even if it's just isiZulu, because isiZulu is more prominent, and he will be able to communicate with his grandparents and just be able to communicate with other people around him. So this is one of the stories, that really resonated with me because I don't know if you guys have seen those memes about, the Joburg cousin who doesn't know how to speak isiZulu, who doesn't know how to speak isiXhosa, and everyone or the other kids are kind of just giggling in the background about this child's inability to speak English, to speak a vernacular language. And so that's kind of like the first thing, the picture that popped into my mind. It was those memes that kind of make fun of it, but also beyond the fun and the shame and the concern that came from Twiter's narrative. Here I see sort of like a longing for access to something more fun, something exciting that otherwise you can't access if you don't speak the language. And it's something that Zizile wanted to make sure that his daughter has. And so after this, of course, then Zizile was very intentional about asking the husband to tell his mom to try and communicate in isiZulu as much as possible to the child, and everyone else around them to try and communicate in isiZulu as much as possible around the child. And then, I'm not going to go into all of the different stories, and if you have sort of like an interest in what other narratives or stories are there, you can just ask in the question and answer session, because what I'm really excited about or interested in is for us to have a conversation about some of these language issues, particularly around the shame, but also around the ideas of access to relationship. some of my participants, of course, when they thought about language acquisition for their children, it was the family element, but it was also about the city of Johannesburg and where they are located and the need to speak African languages in Johannesburg. But for some, they were sort of like reimagining a new South Africa that really celebrates Africanness, where they don't just want their child to speak their mother tongue, but they want their child to speak as many African languages as possible, because they were just like that's sort of like the direction that she had desire for the country to go into. And she wants her child to fully immerse himself in that kind of country by being able to communicate to different people in Johannesburg, but also beyond Johannesburg in the continent. And so that was sort of like a desire that was pretty much shared, even though for different reasons, by the mothers. So I'm just trying to look at the time, Qobani. Okay. I believe I'm still fine. Yeah. So the interesting thing is that even though anthropologists and many scholars have talked a lot about, trying to not create a homogeneous understanding of what identity is like or what culture is, and that it evolves, and that it means different things to different people. Language has kind of been one of those really what's the word I'm looking for? Long-standing signifiers of one belonging to a certain culture, and people continue to use it that way. So parenting in the let's decolonize everything type of context, and let's celebrate ourselves and celebrate where we come from. It was an exciting time for my participants, but also at the same time, it was a worrying time because the mothers felt that they just, no matter how much race work they put in, they still can't determine how their child is going to be treated and how they're going to read, how they're treated, how they're going to deal with it. But so language is one of the very few things that they could actually control, because you either speak the language or you don't. And so whether or not they got the positive affirmation and felt that they belonged and felt seen and felt like they matter, or they would speak their language, and that was a good start. So I think what I want to conclude with is thinking about the shame, thinking about the parents, thinking about their own decisions around what language their children should speak, and also thinking about their desires around language being used to access relationships with your family in rural KZN or with your family in rural Eastern Cape. What is the role of agency of the child in this? At what point does the mother's desire and the child's agency, where do they meet? What's the relationship there? And is there room for a South Africa that's different, where not necessarily South Africa that's different, but a blackness that language is a key important part of it, right? We know Ngugi and his work and all of these scholars that have worked on the issues of language and its really tight connection with culture, but is there room to create something that works for our context now and for the children that are born now? And I think I don't want to get into that myself, but it's something that I really want to use sort of like as a segue into conversation, this conversation part of the seminar where we can all chip in and discuss it. But I just want to sort of like rehash some of the key things that I wanted us to get from this interview to think about. And really, it's just the fact that thinking about the ways in which broader debates about belonging and Blackness and decolonization, even though they look so big and like they are affecting university students and much bigger or people in the workplace, these kinds of conversations definitely filter through into the practice of mothering. And parents seek ways to sort of like stay connected, to make sure that their children stay connected to the kind of context in which they're being raised, particularly in this case in terms of language. So that's the one thing. And that language is in some ways one of the few ways to have a practical pursuit of Blackness and instilling pride in Black children. And then the second part of it is the fact that we've always known that language is access, but a lot of the times in South African context, we've thought about language and English specifically as access to economic opportunities. But in my research, mothers sort of like had a different desire, almost like that part is a given, but there's something else that we need to think about in terms of language, which is using it as access to relationship with cousins and relationships with grandmothers and great grandparents and so forth. That became sort of like a big deal for my participants. But yeah, let me leave it at that and just kind of like open the floor for conversation, because I'm really interested. I see I have a few moms on the chat and moms to be, on the attendance, and I'm just really excited to hear how they're thinking through these kind of issues. And how I'm thinking through this kind of issues, not just as a scholar, but as a parent, because I think one of my biggest people who challenge me in my thinking around language and scholarship and identity and belonging is no one other than my own daughter. And it was just constantly forcing me to rethink my ideas. And I do want to use this opportunity as sort of like another one of learning and just really, it's work in progress, as we know, as always. So yeah, let me leave it at that, Qobani, and you can sort of like take us through the facilitated questions and answers and comments. Thank you so much, everybody, for
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was so rich. I mean, there's so much to unpack from that. But let's take first 3 rounds of questions or comments. So for people who don't know the platform very well, there's an icon. There are 4 icons at the bottom, and one looks like a small person holding their hands up. So if you click on that, I'll be able to monitor who has a hand up or not. Okay, there are already a couple of hands. Okay, so Nolizwe was first. Nolizwe, feel free to unmute yourself or switch on your video if you are comfortable, but you don't have to. And then we'll go to Dr.
Okay, thank you very much. Ziyanda, your presentation, your discussion was absolutely interesting. When I joined, I didn't think it would be on such a personal level, but I think your work has opened up a lot on my side in terms of thinking about language and raising. I've got a 3-year-old son, and we've just moved to KZN after having lived in Joburg, for the most of his early life. I've also been in Joburg. My husband, we're all in Joburg, and suddenly we find ourselves in KZN, where just about everybody speaks isiZulu, And one of the things that I was actually discussing with my husband is how little Venek my son speaks. And in Joburg, it wasn't really a problem, but here I've had a few people sort of ask how nakakhuluma isiZulu, and I'm just like, oh no, it was Sesotho, so that's sort of been, because he understands Sesotho, but he cannot respond just yet. So I think it's really more of a comment to say I appreciate knowing that there are parents, out there who are in sort of a similar situation, and it's sort of encouraging to know that there's a way out of it. Because the other day I was feeling so like, oh, goodness, so disheartened really that if he doesn't learn by now, really what are the odds of him learning, because he's going to start preschool and then go on to school. So I think it's a really intriguing work that you're doing, and if possible, like I mentioned to you when we were on chatting on Instagram, that I would like to read a bit more of your work, because I too myself am working with maternal and child health, and I think this is really, really interesting. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for that very rich comment. Okay,
Hi, Ziyanda. How are you doing? Thank you very much. This has been lovely. And I'm going to take the opportunity to treat it as my own therapy session, because you said we should be drinking coffee, relaxing, and listening. So I'm coming also from my own personal experience, just like Nolizwe, I think a little bit. So I think just a little bit of background. We're in a similar situation where my partner and I speak different languages, right? Both African languages, but we don't understand each other, right? Zulu has been the common language, but it's not his language, and it's not my language, but it's our common language because of growing up in Joburg, and like that's the most accessible language that we have. However, we mostly communicate in English because that's the one that probably comes easiest to the both of us in terms of being able to easily communicate. So that's one thing. And then the other issue then becomes, and you asked about this in terms of like the agency of the child, and unfortunately I'm not even really thinking about the agency of the child right now. I'm coming more from also a slightly different perspective to the two that you've presented, where I wonder if any of your participants brought up the issue of the language that's spoken and who that language belongs to in the family, particularly around in terms of sort of, are you sharing the mother's culture and heritage to the child, or are you sharing the father's culture and heritage to the child? And what does that mean in terms of ideas of identity? And particularly, I'm thinking about this around when women get married, they're the ones that change their surnames. They're the ones that adopt to the husband's culture. They're the ones that sort of, somehow get erased in many ways, right? And language is usually, when you think about it, children are mostly raised around their mother's families a lot of the time. They go to the husband's families, yes, but it's usually the mother, well, from my experience at least, it was usually the mother's families that had the most input, and usually also around language, it was usually the mother's families that had a lot of input around there. So there was somehow a balancing out of sort of this erasure that happens with the legalities of it once you change your surname and all of those things. But there was a way of continuity through language if the child understood the mother's language and those kinds of things. So now there's a situation of, if, for example, also like Nolizwe, we've now moved to a different province where neither of our languages are spoken. So there's no way that the child will pick up either his language or my language. We have to actually make a concerted effort to decide on a language or do both. And not confuse the child in the process. So there's now this like fight within sort of like this notion of patriarchy and wanting to establish one's sort of identity within the sort of like erasure as a woman. So you're saying, oh, but the language can't also go now. You've taken all of these other things, now you want to take the language. So there's also a different clash which can come through where we're now talking about heritage, but it's whose heritage are we actually going to pass along? Because if you're speaking different languages, it becomes a little bit more difficult to say, actually, it's not just the child is learning English, but if we choose one or the other language, we're now also saying that one's heritage is going to go on and continue and the other person's heritage is not. And I wonder if your participants had a similar issue and how they dealt with it.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Let's go to the person whose name is written. All the best, Dr. Majombozi.
Thank you, Qcobani. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Majombozi. So that, I suppose, extract that you shared earlier about your research, I think it'll definitely be discounting it to say that it's interesting. I think it's more than interesting. It's very fascinating to see all of these links, between something that seems quite something that seems quite basic, right? As language and how it can have an impact on an individual's identity, their sense of belonging within the context of motherhood. And I think it's um, such a broad and fascinating area of research. So my question is, to be honest, it's not very well formed. I'm yet to do a little bit more reading in terms of this and the impact that it has on individuals. But what I am curious to know a little bit more about is sort of how different, or maybe how much of an impact do you think it has, the different spaces within which these parents find themselves in? How much of an impact does that have in terms of how concerned they are about whether or not their children, speaks their native language or their mother tongue or vernac, however you want to put it? Because obviously, in the context of a parent or a family growing up in the suburbs, it would be presumably quite different to those growing up in a township or in a rural area. And obviously there's the complication in this, that a lot of the time people in the suburbs do have relatives who live in these rural and township areas, or non-urban areas. So yeah, first part of the question really is, how much of an impact do you feel that it has when they are in these different kinds of spaces? And secondly, on the matter of the agency of kids or children, and I suppose this, the research isn't necessarily focused on that, because it's really more about the mothering within the early stages of motherhood. So it doesn't necessarily look into the future to see how those kids, would feel or would have felt, or how other kids have felt, having not been taught their mother tongue, or having not had the opportunity to develop the ability to speak that mother tongue. Maybe that's more of a comment than a question, but yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna put you on the spot, Ziyanda, because there's still quite a number of hands. So I think let's take the two that have been up, which is Bonani and then Shanae, and then you can respond. There's clearly quite a hunger for discussion for this, and then we'll take one last round after that. Cool, Bonani.
All right. Thank you. Hi, Ziyanda. It was so lovely to just listen to a piece of your research that talks to something that's so personal to us. I'm really interested in the work that you have done, but I've also got a different take, and my take is, it's not actually a take, it's just to put it out there. I think maybe like let me give a context. I'm a mother to a 2-year-old boy, and my frustrations were not finding literature, because people are talking, one of the channels I'm a believer in driving the language, especially if we are living away from a context where the language is spoken, is through literature. And I'm a firm believer in that. I read to my son in Zulu. But what has been frustrating for me is walking into a bookstore and not finding that literature. You can walk into a bookstore right now and you'll get all these stories in English and some in Afrikaans, but you have to hunt down, or if you ask, then they have to go dig, if they have any, at the back of the bookstore, and they'll come back, there's only one copy if you are lucky. And it so happened to me, I went to a prominent bookstore, bought books in isiZulu and isiXhosa, because my nanny is Xhosa, so we just pumping the child in every language, to come home and find that there are typos in the book, grammatical errors, big things. So for me, while there is that discussion, there's also a frustration in the tools that can be made available that are almost non-existent. And recently I purchased, I'm Catholic, I tried to purchase religious book for my son, and in the bookstore that I went to, it's an online bookstore, they only had two. I bought all of them, of course, but they only had two books in isiZulu. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong places, but even that makes me worry to say, why do I have to feel like I'm looking at the wrong places? It should be that where I go, there should be that literature. It should be as accessible as any other literature. So that's my frustrations, and also sort of my take into it, to say, while parents are willing to teach their children language, sometimes the tools are limiting us. And also to question of saying what languages to teach if both parents are from, have different home languages. My take is both languages. Children can learn up to 4 languages from birth. So the most frustrating part is finding the things to teach the language when speak, because of course language is learned in a context, but where there is no such context, I believe literature can drive and fill gaps. But if there's no literature, or if finding the literature is frustrating, that becomes just another hurdle a parent has to sort of jump through, so that they teach their child the language, their home language. But yeah, that's just my intake, but very interesting work, Ziyanda. Thank you so much for this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bonan. Okay, let's just take one more from Shanae, and then I'll come to you, see Wapiwe and Precious, after Dr. Majombozi has responded.
Hi, Ziyanda. Thank you so much for your interesting talk on motherhood, something that is so close to my heart. And I myself am a new mother of a baby boy. He's 1 year old. And I really found it so interesting, you know, when you spoke about how the different, like the moms would speak to their babies in the womb, you know, in their languages, and connect with the baby. And, you know, I was really wondering, like, when do babies actually hear and listen or respond? I would play music from YouTube of like very spiritual music to my son, and I would obviously hope and wait for a response from him in the womb, like a kick or something of that sort. And sometimes I wouldn't. But I actually realized that when he was born and I replayed the same song, there was a response. Like, my son loves this one spiritual song that I played to him. But as he's growing up now, you know, I realize this definition of who is a mother and motherhood is becoming more and more it, you know, it's changing, because right now with COVID and everything, I have a nanny who takes care of my son when I'm busy with my meetings and work and studying and that sort of thing. And you know, when I really question and I look at her, I see this person who is not his biological mother, but is his mother, his friend that's taking care of him. And they have the most wonderful conversations. My nanny is, she's Shona, she's from Zimbabwe. And she sings nursery rhymes in Shona to my son to put him off to sleep. They have conversations. Sometimes she will talk to him in Shona, but he would respond in his baby language. And I really, you know, try to understand. Like, I was telling her the one day that I wish we could decolonize nursery rhymes, you know, Jack and Jill, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And I'm really, it's so hard. Like, is there nursery rhyme in Zulu? How can I sing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star in Zulu or in Shona? Teach me, I want to learn. And now my son, when I really think about it, he's learning, he's growing up in a household where it's English and it's Shona, it's our the entanglement of our cultures, our food, and all of that together. But I was really thinking about, where's this access? How does one gain access to a nursery rhyme, for example, or just like Bonani mentioned, finding literature on stories that, that is in vernacular is so difficult. And how do we go with that? Like, I'm open to my son learning and, embracing, the various culture of, the nanny also being his mother. Like, I look at her in terms of how she cries when he gets sick, that mother instinct, that feeling, what is it called, that matrescence, that maternal feeling is so embedded inside as a woman that we question who is actually the mother here. And also thinking about, what are the roles of the fathers in, how much of a role do fathers actually play in, what's this, ensuring that, the babies learn their language. They taking on their surname. Like, my husband was very prominent. Like, my son takes my surname. He follows my way of life, and very, very masculine kind of a way of raising his son and all of that. But I feel like I'm doing most of the work, and I'm watching my son be, open to learning different languages, a different culture. But here the father wants his son to be, cultured and taught a certain way of life. So I don't know if there's any questions in what I've just said, but I hope maybe I've given you something to think about. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Lovely, lovely. I don't want to ambush you too much, Dr. Majombozi. So let's give you a chance to respond, and then we'll come to you, Siwapiwe and Precious. I haven't forgotten about you, but I think there's been so much that I think it's important we give you a chance to sort of respond to some of these provocations that our colleagues have shared.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Qambela, and thank you so much, colleagues and friends. And I didn't realize there were this many mothers in the audience. And I think first start by thanking Oliva for her comment. And I think her comment speaks a little bit to what Maluboma was saying about whether, or his question about whether or not there's an impact of where you stay or where you're located has an impact on all of these kinds of issues that you're worried about in terms of language. Because like Norisa shares, when she was in Joburg, it wasn't that big of a deal. But when they moved to KZN, then it sort of like became a little bit more in her face, the fact that her son doesn't speak Zulu. And I definitely think, just like I'm saying now with the participants that I had as well, that the thing is that context and changing context definitely has an impact on how we feel about things. There was a time where your child speaking only English was celebrated. It was like, yo, Lomdana is going to get good jobs. They're amazing. Please, your child must come and teach my child to speak English. There was a time in South Africa where that was important because English was the key to economic sort of like, a key to jobs and so forth. And then obviously now in a different context, the language use means something totally different. And actually doesn't mean something totally different because again, context. There are still places where speaking English is still sort of like the top of your mind, your child speaking English is still top of your mind, but Black middle class mothers are not as stressed about their children's access to economic opportunities, but they still have different kinds of challenges around language. So thank you for that comment, Luluzwe. And on the issue of agency, so this came up very strongly for me when I was doing the research, when I was looking at the protests. There were many sessions where students who wanted to join the protests and wanted to join in song and wanted to wholeheartedly be in protest because they believed in all of these calls for, roads must fall and whatnot. But they couldn't speak the language. They couldn't sing the songs. They felt, and it was in that moment where that inspired them some more to really sort of fight for a celebration of these languages, because it felt like an opportunity that they had missed in their own childhoods, whether or not they had agency in the matter or not. But what's interesting for me, though, when I was talking about agency was, what if your child just doesn't like the language? Not doesn't like your language, but like they're just not interested in your language, right? Sometimes your child is not interested, is gendered a certain way, but they're not interested in dresses that you think they should be wearing. They want to wear pants and so forth. So that's sort of like how I was thinking about agency and whether or not there's room for it, or if it's another one of your mom knows best and you will thank me later, that it's Zulu. And then to Gabriel's question about whose heritage, I think this one is a constant struggle and it looks differently in different homes, right? So some of my participants, a lot of them were in marriages that were mixed, in that the husband is Sotho, the wife was Zulu, the husband is Pedi, the wife is Xhosa. And for them, in that context, though, they were very much married to the idea of making sure that their child doesn't have to choose one. They need to learn both languages. They need to learn Zulu, they need to learn the Pedi, they need to learn the Sotho, because they belong to both of the parents. And then to an extent, even in the naming of their children, a lot of the parents were in marriages where the other one is Sotho or Pedi. They would try to make sure that the names reflect the fact that these children are made up of these two people. So they have a Zulu name as well as a Sotho name. But of course, others did sort of like follow the traditional route of, of course, if you have children belong to their mother, as in the mother should transfer culture. It's such an interesting thing. The mother should transfer culture, the mother tongue, and all of these things. It's the mom's responsibility to transfer this to their child, almost like a child must suckle this identity from the mother's breast. But at the same time, it's children belong to their father. So it's such an interesting thing that, would be exciting to see more people explore. But I do think there has been shifts in how younger couples and middle class couples navigate that kind of tension between whose heritage matters and whose language matters. But I think sometimes, especially with regards to language, it comes from a place of not knowing, for example, what Bonani was saying in her comment, that a child can learn so many languages, and there's so many myths around language. You're going to confuse your child if you speak too many languages. Your child doesn't have capacity to learn this many things. And so sometimes we already feel like, well, it's not possible. So we just kind of don't do it, and we don't want to confuse a child, and we do sometimes undermine just how the capacity of children to absorb different languages, but also to understand how sort of like complex belonging and identity can be. And so we, despite our best efforts, are sometimes the ones who sort of like try and start locking children into these boxes. And then in terms of what Bonani was saying, before I get to that, actually, the other question that I wanted to pose to the audience, but reflect on, is sometimes we expect our children to do something that we're not willing to do, or that we're not practicing enough of. So we want our child, for example, to speak both languages, but we're not learning our partner's language, to make sure that the child, everyone in this house, is multilingual. So I guess the old school thing that all parents do, which is that these deep-seated desires to be multilingual that we didn't achieve, and we push them onto our children, as our parents have pushed their own desires in some way onto us. And so there is a question there about this willingness. Shouldn't just be that my child is willing and I want to teach my child, but if we are really reimagining a world where all African languages are celebrated, then maybe as parents themselves, and everyone really, should be more intentional about they themselves learning other languages and being able to access all of these different spaces that they want their child to access. the issue of resources and tools that Bonani and Shanae speak to is one that really, really frustrated. Firstly, it's a frustration that I share, but also a frustration that was shared by my participants, especially with regards. I mean, and I think there's a bigger conversation in the PhD about this, but also in the country. I think even now, there is sort of like a conversation about literature and funding. So there's funding issues and all of many like sort of like issues that are specific to the publishing field. And if there's anyone here who does that kind of stuff, maybe they can enlighten us on those types of issues. But definitely there's a big issue around resources, and especially with books. I mean, you're not just going to find books in VNAC readily available. But the interesting thing for me also is that even the books that are available in VNAC are usually first written in English and then translated into VNAC. And I mean, that has a lot to do with who buys books and where books, and like a lot of, but also because of prejudice that's involved in that. But definitely an issue around books and which books sell and which books editors are willing to buy has a lot to do with. Obviously, it mirrors our other deep-seated issues in the country around race and language and so forth. I remember that actually when I was doing my PhD and I was also pregnant, and I was thinking with other moms that my post-PhD project needs to be creating some type of platform of, at least YouTube videos, and really investing, because there just is not enough investment. I mean, even if you watch the YouTube video, kids videos, a lot of the times you'd be shocked at how the person who's actually reading the story is not a native speaker of the language, and they're not pronouncing words properly. And it's quite disappointing, because then you go like, oh my gosh, I found another Xhosa video, and then you listen to it and you're like, ugh, no, they're not pronouncing things properly. This is not even a Xhosa speaker doing this. Or you go to the books like Bonani says, then there's all of these sort of typos, but also for me, the content in the stories themselves, because the question is, do we want to translate Cinderella, or do we want to hear more of the other stories that we heard growing up in Shomi and use those stories instead? So it's not just about the language and translating things just to English, I mean to vernacular, but it's also about which stories should we be reading, and should it be stories that that resonate with us. But then again, there's that desire that I have coming up, because my child's context is very different from me. So what resonates with her might be very different from what resonates with me. And so that's why sometimes like there's that boundary, trying to draw that boundary between trying not to reproduce yourself, whilst you are very intentional about making sure your child has a sense of belonging. And then I'm in a conversation that I don't think I'm going to go into now also is about, I mean, the question of who's a mother Shanae raises. I mean, that's one that's a lot of scholars talk about, that mothering is a lot of the times just confused with just a biological mom, but there's so many mothers, especially in Black communities. We've seen a lot about, the village raises the child, and sister moms, and even men can mother. So that's just a different conversation. We can go into it if you would like, but I'm wondering if this is the right platform for that kind of conversation. And I think your point about the role of fathers there speaks to what I had said earlier, but there's this idea that the child must suckle, culture and language from your breast, but your child belongs to their father, which speaks to other broader things around patriarchy and how family has been understood and organized in many African countries, and dare I say the world. And so I think that's a much bigger conversation. But yeah, in the thesis, I do talk about some of the tools, and I think it would be another great project would just be the journey to follow moms look for resources, because it really is like a treasure hunt sometimes, because you're not just looking for anything that says it's translated in Xhosa or in Sezulu. You're looking for good quality books that have good storylines. And if you're watching YouTube videos, you want nice animation that your child is going to enjoy. You don't want how sometimes we found in our family that the YouTube videos that are in vernac are so deep. Like there will be cartoons talking about rape and talking about also HIV, talking about the environment. And I'm just like, I just want to say, my child sometimes, yes, these are important, but I want other videos that don't sort of like center struggles that Black people have. But I want my child to talk about apples and bananas in Vernac and just enjoy it, you know. But of course, there's a place for those things as well. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave it at that and take the next question. I hope I've answered.
Sure, fantastic. No, you have. Siwapiwe, over to you.
Enkosi Gcobani, molweni, Dr. Majombozi. This is interesting, and being an anthropologist and also a linguist at the same time, and heading a literacy club for 3 to 12 years old, and hearing conversations about resources, agency, and conceptualizing even the word mother tongue. What does that even mean? But maybe on the question of which languages children should learn, or when the parents are speaking two different languages, why are we even boxing languages? Why are we not communicating? Why do we want to know that this is Xhosa, this is Zulu, this is Sotho, when we are living in a very, very fluid world that got more fluid with COVID and everything else that's happening, where kids can learn and be taught by someone who's not even in a country, where they can communicate with someone who's not even here. But also not running away from the fact that we cannot unlearn everything that we've learned over the years. We can't simply do that. And so with I think it's Unolizwe having to move to KZN, and not stereotypically, but we know that KZN people retain their language, and you get to a point where you assimilate, even if you want or you don't want, because they speak their language. But also maybe just let the kids learn the way they know how. Maybe let them learn through play. I believe in that. They learn through play, and they also have choices, even though we would think that they do not. Even though we would, because I laughed when we started speaking about agency, and I want to pick your brains here around. When you're looking for videos, are you looking for videos that excite you because you know more about the world, or you know what you want your child to learn, or you're looking for videos that would make them excited or make them learn, whatever it means? When you're looking for books, do you look for books that they will enjoy, or you look for books that you think they will enjoy? And in doing that, agency then becomes not questionable per se, but it becomes tricky, because you go to that bookstore and pick those books and come back with them home with the hope that they're gonna learn and thank you later, because moms know best. Again, we cannot run away from that fact. And also, what does it mean in an era? Yes, YouTubes are there. What does it mean in an era where the hard print is slowly and slowly disappearing in getting these resources there? I'm not a publisher, but because I work with children literacy stories and storytelling, I know that there's an issue around the production of resources in Vernac.
Yeah.
One, some people do it because they want to push the agenda of storytelling in African languages, of Vernac and story writing and everything. But at the end of the day, they need funds and resources to publish those books. Imagine that there is a political dynamic in who buys what and where. You go to a prominent bookstore. I got the same thing with you, Bonani, and I left because I was so heartbroken that, okay, Shab, okay, well, they did translate, but who was the last person who read this and decided that it's fine, it's good for publishing? I was so hurt. and I left. So you get to a bookstore, the very same book, sort equivalent to the English book. Yours is 70 rand, theirs is 220. And you were doing this because you want to make sure that children get the resources. As frustrated parents, as frustrated teachers, as frustrated country, you do this because you want them to learn. But then also, how are you gonna generate revenues to publish more if your book is 70 rand and the other one is 200 rand? There's that dynamic as well. And also for the mothers that would love to sort of put their hands on some translated stories. Yeah, they are translated stories. They were from English and they got translated into all the other 11 African languages. On Nalibali, some of us might know about Nalibali, some of us might not. And also there's a publisher called Book Dash. It's a publisher slash an NGO. They sponsor, their dream is to distribute 1 million Vernac books in a year. So they sponsor literacy clubs and they also sell some copies, I think starting from 10 rands, because they need to generate revenues to do that. Thank you, Dr. Majombozi. The other thing I wanted to say in this, in the translation process, there is money involved there. Maybe if there was a will to redistribute that money to give upcoming authors that can, even children as writers, because I know there are children who can write stories that relate to them, because at this point we are thinking for them. And that's one thing that's not gonna work for us. We're gonna buy books and they're gonna stay there because they don't relate to them. We must not also forget that we grew up in another era, and in our minds, Geshem is Aram. We want to be better than our parents, but we replicate that in a different manner. They wanted us to be doctors, and now that they were nurturing us in that way, we're nurturing our kids in another direction, but still doing the same thing that our parents were doing. Let's forgive ourselves for that, but then just be aware that we're doing the same thing. This is a very tricky language, and culture and identity, and our living is a very tricky subject, because it's an intertwined. As much as you would want to say, I'm not going to say you cannot learn a language without knowing the culture, but still, some of the saying in those languages and how they say things and how you can understand them, they come from the way of living. They come from the way of relating to that language. So for you to speak the language, you also need to relate to it. So in closing, I wanted to my other friend in terms of translation and equating languages, because when children learn different languages at the same time, the thing that we would do is to equate that Vernac to English, and sometimes it does not make sense and it does not work. And then we realize, oh, okay, no, it's fine, let them learn English. And like I go to work, come back, do this and that and that and that and that, and it gets messy. We try so much to equate our African languages to English, maybe knowing exactly or not aware that languages stem from cultures and the way of living, so they will never make sense. I spoke to my other friend this other time, calling me, "Hi Chomi, intoni imbeleko ngesilungu?" Meaning, "Hi Chomi, what is imbeleko in English?" And I was like, "Ayikho, there's none. It's imbeleko, it's not English, there's none. It's imbeleko." The only thing that you can do if you want someone else to understand is to explain what imbeleko is, and not saying that the name imbeleko means that in English. You can only explain to them, "Ayikho, it's none." So in us trying to get our kids in learning all these languages that we're trying to box so much, because that has been the way of living. I don't mind if my kid can speak like 4 languages in one sentence. It's fine, because kakate, a language is a tool to communicate and express yourself. Why are we complicating it to be, okay, this is English, so we speak English? And not that I'm bashing other people's parenting. We even have lots in the house. We have a policy, a house language policy. Okay, fine. In the evening, we have to speak isiXhosa. Yes, we're trying. We're all trying to get at them in learning these languages. But also maybe just relax a bit. Buy the books that you can buy. Maybe by the age of 5, they will know their favorite stories. They'll know what that means, and that's where the questions come in. And then when you want to get your English equivalent, if there's none, there's none. Just explain to them what that means. Language is complex. That's all I'm going to say. And thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Precious? And then we'll come to you, Shanae.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Of poetry as a theorizing
Yes.
tool, I think is super useful.
Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can, but there's a background noise. But we can hear you. I think you can get your point across.
Somehow feel compelled to theorize, and the question is why.
Looks like Precious is attending 2 seminars at the
Precious,
same time.
are you on 2 seminars? Okay, I think now the other one is muted. Precious, are you there? Okay, I think whilst we wait for Precious, I'll message her privately in the chat. Shanae, you can go. There was a hand up.
Okay, Ziyanda, so I was just thinking about language, and I'm not sure, maybe if I missed it in your research, like when you were speaking about it. Do you speak about the importance of sign language in your research? Because like I think about like growing up my son, and that at 6 months there was this need, like I had all these baby apps, and that would initiate the mother for me to initiate using sign language with my son. So what does food mean? I've had enough. Using different signs for communication. So have you spoken, or have you included the importance of sign language in your research? Yeah, and maybe you can speak about that.
Okay, lovely. Let's try Precious one more time before Dr. Majombozi's response. Precious, are you sorted now? I don't think she is. Okay, please respond so long, Ziyanda, and then we're gonna take last burning ones and then close.
Okay. Thank you, Shanae and Siwa. And I think to answer, I guess Shanae's question, it's a much quicker one to respond to. No, I don't speak to sign language in my research, mainly because none of my participants expressed an interest or concern around whether or not their children can communicate in sign language. And I think this also goes back to what Usiwa was saying, that at the end of the day, language is about communication, even though, of course, as I mentioned in the presentation, that even though anthropologists and all sorts of scholars keep talking about how, it's fluid and da-da-da, and it evolves, language seems to be really sort of like, it refuses to go away as something that's closely linked to culture and identity and so forth. So I guess because for my participants, they were not thinking about language just as communication, but they were thinking about it as communication, but also as a way to belong to culture and to a certain identity and to certain families. Because sign language was not a thing, for them, it's not one that they felt their children, they weren't against it, but it's not one they discussed as something that their children need. And then to Sue's question about the role of why are we putting language in boxes? I love that question, because it's an interesting thing where we're in a cycle, I guess, because I think sometimes when you are in a place where you feel like you need to fight, right, for something. So in this case, it's African people fighting for a country where their language is seen and their culture is seen and their children are made to matter and the languages they speak are made to matter. But also if you think about Ngugi, about how language is how we used to transport culture, and it's the language of our dreams, it's the language of our ancestors and so forth. That's sort of like I think in some ways the reason why we continue to keep the boxes, because we're so scared that if we don't hold on to the box, we're going to lose it completely, because it's going to be like, what is even this thing that we're fighting for? But if you think about it also, in terms of just practically, like if my concern, for example, about language is for my daughter to go to Eastern Cape and communicate with her cousins and her aunt and her grandparents who don't speak English and really not need a translation, or whatever is happening, she doesn't need a translation. She can fully immerse herself in it and really enjoy it. I can understand her in my house when she speaks a mixed masala, but I don't know. In fact, we already know what that looks like. We've had our fair share of giggling at people who speaks broken isiZulu, broken isiXhosa. So I think it's because of the context that we are in, not saying that it's what should be happening or justifying it, but saying that it's kind of the reality. It is what it is. It's sort of like, well, this is the context that we live in. We are, as we are with most things, we're very like obsessed with keeping things pure, right? I mean, purity is a problem everywhere, and the obsession with purity is a problem everywhere. And I think with language, it's not just an obsession with purity, but it's also a matter of I need to fight to keep the fire burning of my language, because it's sort of like a big part of who we are as a people. And so we need to keep it pure and we need to keep it clean. So I think that's one of the reasons why we continue to create these boxes. And I mean, funny enough, on the question that you're asking about, am I looking for things that excite me in the videos or things that excite my daughter? That's a funny one, because we've definitely had our fair share in our household where we are excited about certain songs and not so much about certain songs. We even have some favorite songs and we have least favorite songs. But I do think, I mean, same with the videos, it's the same issue of budget and I think, and resources and lack of investment. There's just something about, not just the songs, but also the video itself and the quality of the video and the cartoon and whatnot. And in my case, my daughter, for a longest time, I would try to, there's a channel on YouTube called, there's one Xhosa Kids and there's also one Zulu Kids. But the videos are so whack, if I were to be honest. The videos themselves are so whack. The songs are fine. There's no rhythm though. And I later found that it's not actually even South Africans behind that channel. But the music just wasn't exciting. And so a lot of the times my daughter would say no and show me which one she wants. And to my, like frustration and be like, oh my gosh, what have I done? It would be the pale looking kids with an ice cream jumping up and down, singing in English about their happy family or singing about their favorite dog. Things that I'm just like, that's why, how is this happening? I thought, I would do this differently. But yeah, that's also the part of the agency that I was talking about, is if she decides that she likes CoComelon, because she likes the graphics in CoComelon, should I be forcing her to like the Xhosa Kids channel because I feel like that's what she needs? Because I worry about when we are in Cape Town and she can't understand her cousins and the look on her face when she kind of offers a bit of a confused smile that says, I have no idea what the heck is going on. It's kind of some of the ways in which I was thinking about that.
Lovely. Precious, are you sorted? We're going to take one last burning rounds or comments. So you didn't get an opportunity. Are you sorted now?
Hello.
Hi, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry for what happened earlier. I don't know what was happening. Dr. Majombozi, thank you so much for the great presentation. As a young anthropology student, just starting her journey in research, looking at the aspects of language and how language can be a barrier in some situations, I was kind of I'm interested in how language shapes the ways in which children, especially the youth, view the political representation of the state, right? How can I phrase this out? Okay, I can say that culture plays a critical role in everything as children are socialized within their households, right? So during that process of socialization having been a continuous process. At home, they are socialized using their vernacular language. And then when they go out to school, meet with students, they are taught one dominant language is English that has become a norm. I can say that even if I go home, it's kind of difficult for me to say a proper sentence without putting in an English word there. And I kind of ask for translations of particular cultural names from my parents on what that name is in English. So what I would love to say is that I love the work that you're doing and looking at it through the dimensions of motherhood, how motherhood is viewed at a societal level and the actual challenges that our parents face with children. It's very critical to kind of explore and go deeper, looking at other social factors that shape this phenomenon around children, as well as some structural violence factors that perpetuate the use of English as a dominant language and children abandoning their own home language. Yeah, that's all what I wanted to say basically. I know it wasn't framed that well, but yeah, that's all I wanted to say because I know that culture is both in the mind and is a practice. So it's very difficult with the youth of this 21st century to be taught on how to do this and do this due to these changes that are happening. That's all I wanted to say. That thank you so much for the good work.
Thank you, Precious.
Thank you so much, Precious. Okay, just before you respond, Doc, because I also want you to use your response to sort of close us off. So I guess you can prepare for that. If there's any last burning comments, particularly if someone hasn't had an opportunity to ask or make their comment, this would be the opportunity because we're going to close shortly. But whilst I give people an opportunity to, I guess, ask last burning round, I think my contribution is so interesting. I mean, I really enjoyed this presentation and certainly your work, and certainly can't wait for it to be more available for the public and for us to prescribe and to continue to have these conversations, right, in different spheres. But I was thinking as I was listening to you, I guess a question of what would a utopia look like for the contemporary, I guess, African child when it relates to issues of language, right? And the reason why I ask this is because, I mean, it's a common, and that's the sort of ravages of colonialism, which is, it always feels like Black people are always chasing something, right? So I was reading this book by Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry, What Happened to You, and they have an interesting findings, particularly from Dr. Bruce Perry of over, 30, 40 years of working in trauma. And one of the things that he's learned, we've always known that, the first 5 or 6 years of life are the most crucial, right? And that, those few years determine everything else, right? In terms of your life trajectory. But the interesting thing that he's found is actually it's not just the first 6 years, it's actually the first 2 months of you being born. And when Shanae was making the comment about the child almost remembering, right, in a way that they're not even conscious of, but their argument is that the first 2 months actually are quite central, not just in terms of our development, but also issues around language development, the kind of exposure that they have. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is really the question of what does utopia look like for us, where we are not always working to correct, right? It's quite ironic in a country where Zulu is the most spoken language, but we have to fight for rights. You have to struggle to find a book in isiZulu or in isiXhosa, and so on. So I guess I'm asking what would that utopia, I guess, for not just for yourself, but for your interlocutors look like, of where we are no longer, chasing, the language that we've lost, but that it's a norm that, that I guess that our kids speak multiple languages and so on. I hope that makes sense. Okay, it doesn't seem like there's another question, so you can also just use that to close us off.
So, I mean, when you ask what utopia looks like, I think the first thing that came to mind, that popped into my head, is when you enter a supermarket in Johannesburg and you watch the cashier and one person says Molo and she responds and is closer. And then someone taps on her shoulder and she starts speaking Pedi. And then someone across the room calls her and she starts speaking Tonga. And it's just normal, So I wish I could walk into a classroom one day and there's just like a buzz of different languages going on in the classroom. Or a student says something in Tonga and anyone can, because they feel like whatever they want to say in that moment can best be described in that language or makes more sense in that language. And everyone can join that conversation because it's just so normal to speak in whatever language makes sense for whatever story you need to tell in that moment. And that's what it looks like. And it also looks like walking into a bookstore and not having to wait for them to dig in the back room to see if they have any other copies of the book that I'm looking for. But also, to know that my daughter at school, even if it's not in a place where Xhosa has a predominantly spoken language, but she can pick up a book at school that is in Xhosa, and it's not just the work. I mean, it is my work because I'm the parent, but also just that putting almost equal or even more importance, in my opinion, on our languages. Treating them equally at schools, seeing them as equal, and seeing them as important languages to be used would be, I think, utopia for me. But also, I do think in this conversation, it's important to, I like what you're saying, to not always look at what we've lost, because I do think sometimes, and not to be ableist here, I just can't think of a better word, we get paralyzed by what we've lost. And we spend so much time trying to get back what we've lost, and we forget to live in the moment, We forget to enjoy our child speaking 5 languages in one sentence, even though they're not fluent in either one of them. And we lose opportunity to enjoy the new languages that people create and that people put together, because we're so obsessed in making sure that we don't lose. And of course, I understand why the loss is such a big deal. We live in a country where Black people have lost so much, and that Black people continue to do so much work to regain what they've lost. In terms of dignity, but also in terms of economically, there's just so much loss that we have faced as a people that we're always trying to go back and get it all back. We want land back, or we want our languages back, and there's so many things we want to get back. But I do worry that sometimes we get so lost in the things we're trying to get back that we forget about what we have right now. So I guess part of utopia for me is the fact that if my child speaks only English, it's not a thing that I'm embarrassed about, as I must confess, can be quite embarrassed about when we walk into a supermarket and I speak English to her, because I'm just like, I'm too lazy to have to work through this slowly in Xhosa with her. And I know that if I say this in English, she's going to know exactly what I mean. And to be able to do that and not be so concerned about, oh my gosh, everyone is going to think I think Xhosa is inferior and everyone is going to think that I'm colonized. So I guess that's to say the shaming that goes around, because I do think sometimes it's not productive, is one of the things. But while celebrating where we are now, to also share resources. I mean, I've shared a few in the chat, but if we want to be intentional about this kind of language, because it is still a very good way to access, even if we were to take it outside of culture and tradition, but also it's just a really nice way and important way to access relationship with loved ones. I mean, there's so many times where I say a joke in Xhosa and I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's no way I can translate this. And I want my daughter to actually get it, for me to not have to be like, yo, how can I, you know? I think there's a richness of relationship there that can be accessed by talking in Xhosa, and that's how she would be able to other relationships need to be facilitated in certain languages, and English is not always you know, the most productive language to use in a situation. So to learn how to be in the utopia that I speak of, I need her to speak Xhosa, I need her to speak isiZulu, I need her to speak Tsonga, I need her to speak Swahili, you know, in an increasingly diverse metropolitan city like Johannesburg. So yeah, that's I think I'm gonna leave it at that, and to just thank you guys once again, and to say there is absolutely nothing wrong, and I think we should pursue things that make sense to us, whilst also making sure that we're not living our children's lives for them, like Siwa was saying, in the sense that your desire for your child to learn. I mean, I've heard, and this is no shade to any parent for how they choose to parent, situations where parents are so desperate to reinforce a language that, you know, if you don't speak in Xhosa, I'm not going to respond. You can stand there. If you can't figure out how to tell me that you want food in Xhosa, then you're not getting food from me, you know. So I do think that a lot of it, we do need to remove ourselves. We need to remove the shame and the sense of loss, so that we can enjoy our children and allow them to enjoy their lives as they are in a city like Johannesburg, you know, and in a city like Cape Town. They have to be where they are, and there's no way that they're going to be exactly like your cousins' children who are growing up in Eastern Cape or in KZN. They're different, and that's okay. We should be able to celebrate that difference even amongst ourselves, without sort of like the burden of shame, and particularly with regards to one's culture. And also class, actually, because the shame is that, oh, just because we have money now, you think your child doesn't need to speak or whatever. So let's just take away the shame and try to be in the moment. And I think that's a sense where some of my participants were able to get to, but some of them were not able to get out of it, because in that particular point in time, which was between 2016 and 2019, there was so much noise about a Blackness that is heavily associated with an ability to speak an African language. And so they couldn't get out of that, and they were just sort of like constantly stressed and trying to find resources out of desperation. And I think, yeah, maybe the approach might need to change. But yeah, thank you everybody, and thank you for the comments as well. I see in the chat from Bumi and Precious, and thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was so rich, and I think you've given us so much to meditate and to think about. And I think the comments and the rich discussions show the hunger that people have for this important research that you've given us. So we please, yes, share links as soon as publications come up, so we can blast it, as well as cite not only Black but cite Black women. Cool. Thank you, everyone.